In the beginning, a wind blew across the waters, and so life began. And the name of this wind was Viracocha, and the whole of the earth and sky was his home. And after Viracocha came Inti, the god of the sun, and his sister Quila, the goddess of the moon, and they were the rulers of life. And after these three came the Inca, the divine ruler of the empire called Tahuantinsuyu, the land of the four directions. And the Inca ruled men. Tahuantinsuyu, the empire of the Inca, was a great land, for it extended from the shores of the Pacific Ocean in the west, across the high Andes Mountains to the borders of the Amazon jungles in the east, and from the cold lands of Chile in the south to the hot, wet swamps and jungles and mountains of Colombia in the north. In years past, the Inca's armies had defeated many powerful tribes and had made them part of the empire. And many other tribes had asked to join, for, thought their chiefs, better to be rewarded by the Inca and to be treated as a friend than to have the Inca's armies come. For the Inca's armies would not be long in coming if he thought it necessary, because through his whole empire ran two mighty highways, north to south, one through the mountains and the other through the desert lands of the coast, and many smaller roads linked them. Along these highways would move the soldiers of the Inca, jog-trotting 30 to 40 kilometers each day on their way to defeat the enemies of the empire. On these roads, too, traveled porters who carried heavy burdens of trade goods up into the mountains or down to the coast. For the people of the empire had never used wheels or known of horses. They had only the llama, a beast much smaller and weaker than a horse, and sometimes slow caravans of these animals would pass along the roads carrying their little loads. In the fields beside the roads toiled the people of the villages, tending their crops. The men turned the soil with digging sticks, and the women planted the seed, and the children weeded. With their slingshots, the boys drove small animals and birds from the fields. This was the start of their training for the army, for later they would spend at least part of their lives as soldiers. And the girls, as they walked to the fields beside their mothers, learned to spin thread, of cotton or of the wool of the llama. All the children learned the work of their parents and knew that when they grew up, they would do the same work. Some of them would weave thread into beautifully patterned cloth, and some would turn stone into buildings or clay into pots, just as their parents and grandparents had done. And some would pan the rivers for gold and silver washed down from the mountains, and others would turn these metals into handsome ornaments. All things that the people did were seen and noted by the Inca's officials. Each village and town had its quota of goods to produce, and each year these goods would be measured and recorded and divided up, some for the villages themselves, and some for their lord and protector, the sun god, and some for his servant, the Inca. There was no system of writing in the empire, but the officials kept their records on quipus, bands of knotted strings of different colors, and these were carried back to the Inca himself by messengers, who relayed the information from one to another across the land until at last it reached the palace of the Inca in Cuzco, the capital of the empire. Cuzco was a great city of stone, built in a high valley of the Andes Mountains in a part of the empire called Peru. The Inca's palace was splendid, but even more wonderful was his garden, for in it the plants were made of finely worked gold and silver. Most splendid of all was the Temple of the Sun, called Curencancha, the House of Gold. For around its outside walls ran a great golden band like a ray of the sun itself. And inside, covering one whole wall, was a sheet of pure, glowing gold, on which were shown the gods of the sun and the moon and the stars, and the story of the world's creation. And the people worshipped their gods in gladness, thankful for their protection, and were pleased to live and work in their service, and in the service of the Inca, their divine ruler. And so the years passed in the land of the four directions, and few things changed. For what need was there of change? The gods of the sun and the moon watched over the people, and ordered their day and their night, and their summer and their winter, and made their crops to grow. But nothing lasts forever. At last, in the time of the 12th Inca, change came to the empire. From the northern border came messengers, who told of strange men, white-skinned and bearded, who sailed in huge ships upon the northern seas. The Inca, listening, wondered at this, for he had long heard stories of a white god who had vanished into the sea long ago and who would return one day to claim his land again. Thought the Inca to himself, if these white men to the north are indeed the god's servants, all will be well. But if they are not, there may be trouble, and I am too old now to deal with trouble. My eldest son, Huascar, who will be the next Inca, is neither intelligent nor courageous. What can I do to protect my people? Now the Inca had a younger son, a cunning and warlike man named Atahualpa, and he called this son before him. My son, I fear for my people, and so I have decided that after I die, you will be equal ruler with Huascar, your brother. Rule my empire wisely. And so the empire was ruled now by 2 Incas, where before only one had ruled. The people wondered at this, and wondered even more when the 2 Incas quarreled with each other and fought army against army until Atahualpa was triumphant over his older brother Huascar. The people were astonished. How could this be, they wondered, that there should be fighting and killing between the servants of Inti, the sun god? They were confused, and their faith was shaken. And it was now, at this difficult time, that the white-skinned, bearded strangers arrived at the borders of the empire. As the old Inca had feared, they were not at all the servants of a god, but were men, warlike and savage and greedy for gold. There were not many of them, less than 200, and despite their superior weapons and the huge, frightening animals they rode, they might quickly have been defeated by the great armies of Atahualpa, the new Inca. But Atahualpa, the Inca, was tired from war, and so he did nothing, while the white men marched towards him. They were Spaniards, and they had come from the north, from the settlement of Panama, on the narrow neck of land joining North to South America. They were fortune hunters, desperate men in search of gold and conquest, and the most desperate of them all was their leader, Francisco Pizarro. He'd lived in the New World for many years, and had been on many expeditions in search of wealth, but always he had been disappointed. Until now, he thought, as he looked upon the country through which he passed. This land has even more wealth than Mexico. I shall be richer than Cortez. And so, watched from hiding by Atahualpa's spies, Pizarro eagerly drove his soldiers onwards, up into the thin, cold air of the high mountains, towards the city where the Inca waited. At last, in mid-November of the year 1532, the white strangers emerged from a pass in the mountains and looked down upon Cajamarca. But the city was empty.
But see,
shouted one of the soldiers, pointing.
There, on the hillside, beyond the town.
His voice was filled with horror, for the hillside was covered with thousands of tents. The Spaniards were appalled.
What can we do against such an army?
Their dreams of gold and glory vanished. They cared only for their lives. Even the reckless Pizarro felt in his heart the cold touch of fear, but he concealed it from his men and led them down into the deserted city. Would they ever come out alive? On the hillside beyond the town, among the countless tents of his mighty army, sat Atahualpa, the Inca. He saw a small band of armored horsemen leave the city and ride towards him. The horses and their shining armored riders frightened and astonished the Indians, but the Inca himself was unmoved and showed neither fear nor curiosity. The horsemen halted, and one of them shouted at the Inca,
"My master sends you his compliments and desires that you come soon to meet with him."
Still the Inca said and showed nothing. Angered by the Inca's calm silence, the Spaniard spurred his horse into a gallop, then suddenly reined it in so that it reared above the seated Inca. Its hooves flashed dangerously before his face, and several of his guards recoiled in terror, an act for which they would soon be executed. But Atahualpa himself seemed hardly to notice. "I shall call upon your master tomorrow," he said, his voice calm and clear. "He and his men are to remain where they are in the town and await my coming." But that night, despite his show of calmness, Atahualpa was afraid. He thought to himself, "I have murdered my brother, the true Inca, the true servant of the sun god. Are these white-skinned barbarians to be the instruments of the god's revenge?" Below, in the silent city, the white-skinned strangers, too, could not sleep. On the dark hillside above them twinkled thousands of campfires, like stars in the night sky, and they waited in terror for the morning. Like the Inca, Pizarro, too, was alone. His mind raced.
"I am 52 years old,"
he thought.
"I was born poor. I have faced danger and death 100 times. Yet still I am poor. This is my last chance."
And he decided upon a desperate plan. All the next morning, the Spaniards, their mouths dry with fear, watched and waited. At noon, the Inca's warriors began to assemble in their thousands on the plain outside the city. At last, toward sunset, a huge squadron of brightly dressed Indians entered the city, sweeping the ground before them as they came. They were followed by many more thousands, dancing and singing. And then, among a great crowd of Indian nobles, came the Inca himself, Atahualpa, riding in state in a gleaming litter of gold and silver. But where was the Spanish army? Only Pizarro, a few soldiers, and a priest stood waiting in the city square. Where were the others? The priest stepped forward before the Inca and presented him with a Bible.
"This is the true word of God,"
he cried, and he demanded that Atahualpa give up his old beliefs and become a Christian. Who are these white barbarians, that they should insult me and my gods? Thought Atahualpa, and he flung the Bible into the dust, and he pointed to the great red sun that hung low over the western mountains, and shouted, "Your God died upon the cross, while mine still lives in the heavens and watches over his people."
"Sacrilege!"
snapped Pizarro, and he stepped forward and seized the Inca's arm, and in a loud voice cried out the old battle cry, "Santiago!" Immediately, from the buildings all around the square, the muskets and cannon of the hidden Spanish soldiers rang out, firing directly into the great crowd of unarmed Indians. And then on foot and horseback, the white men charged. Indians tried to flee, but there were few exits from the square, and so most were trapped and died before the guns and swords of the white men. Night fell, and the moon shone down upon a city filled with Indian corpses, and upon the celebrations of the Spanish, and upon the Inca in chains. But still Atahualpa held himself proudly. He told Pizarro, "You must release me. My warriors surround you, and will soon return to set me free." Pizarro laughed.
"In which case you will die, be assured of that. No, your people must buy your freedom. 1 room filled with gold and 2 rooms of silver. That is my price.
And so from all over the empire came long lines of burdened porters, bowed down beneath their loads of treasure. The people gave everything they had to buy back the life of their living god, the Inca. At last, Atahualpa was brought before Pizarro.
The rooms are full. The price is paid, but I cannot let you go. For what protection will we have them against your armies?
Atahualpa's heart sank within him, but he spoke with dignity. And what protection will you have if you keep me imprisoned? My people will not wait forever. Pizarro smiled cruelly.
Yes, they will,
He replied.
for you will never return to them. You are to die, burned at the stake. And then I do not think your armies will attack us, for we shall have killed their god.
And so it was. The divine Inca, the child of the sun, was killed by the white strangers from across the sea. At the last moment, to avoid the terrible pain of burning, Atahualpa agreed to become a Christian. And so in the city square at Cajamarca, where so many of his people had died before him, he was strangled. And it was as Pizarro had predicted. Without the Inca, their living god, the people of the empire became confused and frightened and did nothing. When the gods die, men's hearts die also. And through the confusion of the empire marched Pizarro and his little army. They entered the capital, the great city of Cuzco, and took it and the whole empire for Spain. In the years that followed, more and more white men arrived, and they went out across the land and took everything for themselves. They opened mines for gold and silver, and took the Indians from their fields and turned them into miners. And so the crops were not planted and did not grow, and the Indians starved. Or they died of the new and terrible diseases that swept across the land, or they escaped into the highest parts of the wild mountains or into the Amazon jungles and made raids upon the white men. But even these rebels died or disappeared after a time. But life continued, for not all the Indians of the empire died, nor was their civilization entirely destroyed. Some things remained. The wind still moved on the water, and the sun and moon still passed across the sky. But they were gods no longer. To Tahuantinsuyu, the land of the four directions, change had come at last.